Started. Okay, let's start then. Welcome everybody. Welcome students and anyone tuning in online. Thank you for joining this event. I'm Gabriel Cuellar, an assistant professor of practice here at the University of Minnesota, and delighted to organize the events this week, which are exploring the concept of lowercase a architecture, diverse spatial material practices concerned with spatialities, constituencies, processes, and values beyond the presets of capital A architecture. I'm very pleased this morning or this afternoon for Omar, our guest, the first of our four guest speakers this week, Omar Nagati. Welcome, Omar. Thank you so much for joining us. Our faculty and students are thrilled to work with you this week. Omar Nagati is an architect, an urban designer, and a researcher living in Cairo. He studied at Cairo University, the University of British Columbia, and the University of California, Berkeley, where he has also taught. Omar also led and participated in numerous workshops, symposia, and conferences internationally, as well as the architecture biennials in Venice, Lisbon, and Seoul. Omar, together with Beth Stryker, is the co-founder and principal of Cluster, a Cairo lab for urban studies, training, and environmental research, an award-winning platform established in the wake of the 2011 revolution in Egypt. Through Cluster, Omar has created an experimental hub for activist spatial practice that works across critical theorization, community organizing, urban research, situated architectural interventions, exhibitions, and online platforms. Working in downtown Cairo, as well as the city's periphery, and other cities such as Amman, Beirut, and Dar es Salaam, Cluster focuses on urban dynamics and finds opportunities to advance the agency of local communities in public space. As much as Omar and his collaborators are involved in analysis, documentation, and conceptual framing, which can be appreciated in Cluster's rich publications, the organization initiates, organizes, and intervenes, taking action on the ground through the implementation of small-scale design projects. In contrast to the design of master plans or exceptional sites, Omar's work deals with the everyday and the ordinary, taking on urban diplomacy, protest, civil society, circular design, public space, informality, and more. One of Omar's ongoing projects studies the emergence of what Cluster has termed grounded urban practices, which we will have the pleasure to hear more about today. In short, Cluster is a platform for developing and appreciating forms of urban knowledge and action, revealing who has a stake, what is at stake, and how to engage with it. We have a Q&A session to look forward to following Omar's talk. For those of you in the Zoom webinar, I invite you to pose questions in the Q&A box or raise your digital hand. Thank you again, Omar. Welcome, and we will turn now to your presentation.
Thank you, Gabriel, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me to such an important forum. I'll try to resume screen sharing immediately to start the call. Do you see the screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, and just okay, good. Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity. I think this is a great framing of the topic. I'm really delighted to be part of this workshop in the next few days. So what Gabriel asked me to do is to, I think he did a great introduction. What basically I will try to do today is to tell you basically a story about an emerging initiative in response to larger political, economic, and urban transformations over the past decade or so. And try to make the case that what we're doing here at Cluster, and this work is obviously the work of a larger group, is really representative of a larger phenomena or a movement that is taking place not only in Cairo or the region, but across the globe, what we call grounded urban practices. So what I will do is to tell you more about this practice, the way we do it, some of the projects, design and research and mapping, some of the programs. And then towards the end, we kind of reflect a little bit and try to frame it in more of a sort of to conceptualize it in a broader sense. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump into some provocative images that may resonate with other cities in the global south, but also in North America, I believe. Political protest and urban protest is something that is commonplace everywhere. This is an incident in 2016 in which people were protesting outside the syndicate of journalists, protesting the decision by the government to hand over 2 islands to a neighboring country. The reasons are not as important, but the importance here is the conflict and the contestation and the confrontation between different groups, different narratives of the city. This is another one, smaller scale, activists and artists and civil society actors, also downtown, protesting the demolition or attempt to demolish a very important art house called Townhouse in the city center. Again, you can see the standoff between security police and activists and artists. Now, what these 2 images represent are 2 narratives or 2 positions vis-a-vis what the city should be like and what stories do we have and what ownership do we have over public space. So I'm just putting this on the table and then we'll move and maybe come back to them, but we are interested, as Gabriel said, in the everyday or ordinary urban interventions. You can call it the vernacular, the everyday, the informal, if you will, and they might go unnoticed, ranging from a storefront expanding or spilling over the sidewalk, and therefore, let's say, taking part of public space, to somebody fencing off a planter to prevent people from sitting, etc. These are very small interventions, but they are very telling because they represent certain interests and also frame of reference. And we'll talk more about that. We're also interested in how state and non-state actors claim a certain part of public space using almost the same language as the same tools, demarcation tools of territoriality, yet some of them is legitimate, some of them are illegitimate, and we ask why. We're interested to document the subtle or not too subtle confrontation between, let's say, the municipality police evicting or removing coffee shops because they are quote unquote illegal, or the more sort of drastic or pronounced confrontation between security forces and protesters. And we see how the community is able to resolve a small conflict, like the image to the left, I'm sorry, on its own, and how this resolution is being attained informally versus, as I said, the more drastic and more formal approach of resolution or eviction. This is an image of a classic image of Tahrir Square in 2011, and how the city becomes literally a canvas for certain narratives, for certain messages by the protesters or by the authorities, and how these narratives could be engraved not only on the buildings, but also in 3-dimensional on airplanes. There was a moment in the city, there was a contestation between former president and a subsequent president. And the parties of both candidates were writing their support on the walls, literally. And every week, the walls would be painted over and then re-inscribed. And so the city here is literally a canvas. There's no metaphor or symbolism here. It's literally a canvas. So we're interested to see that. And we're interested to see like how major spaces like Tahrir Square could be viewed as a space of sort of reconstitution of social movement, and how the state tries to counter that by using cosmetic and landscape element to preempt or prevent protests, such as planting or building a what used to be a memorial for the martyrs, but it got demolished by the protesters. So the state sort of sent the guards to protect it. And then finally, they decided to put another sort of, let's say, agreed upon symbol, which is the flag. Now, all these are the physical and spatial elements to claim certain narrative in the city and public space. And there was the moment of revolt 10 years ago. And I would like to maybe stop here and start our, because this is where we were founded, when the city started to go through an upheaval, and we wanted to be part of this urban transformation. So I'm going to show you a number of projects from the first phase of engaging this political transformation through mapping and archiving, then to more sort of proactive engagement by proposing intervention public space and building databases, etc. So there are like, basically we can look at the last decade as part of 3 phases for cluster, but I think there are 2, let's say, periods or 2 phases. One we call a city in flux, at the peak of the revolution, when things were being unraveled, the regime was toppled, and there was a lot of opportunities to do things without being, let's say, controlled or monitored, or you need a permit. There's a lot of possibilities. Then with the restoration of order, things became more difficult, and you're no longer able to do a grounded research as such. So you start to move to more reflective positions. So, and then when things got even more difficult, you start to go regional. So I'm going to talk about these basically 3 stages in our career as a framework to understand these projects. So the first one is, we call it City in Flux, and you can see it was really a moment of violence and confrontation. So to do that, just a brief background on Cairo. Is a city of 20 million. Like any other large city, it's multi-layered and complex, but you can sort of abstract it into 3 major urban conditions. And I'm following David Sims' characterization. So what you can call the urban core, deteriorating urban core, the city center, the orange patch. These are planned district over 2 centuries or something. Then we have an informal belt, which is community response to the absence of the state, the withdrawal of the state, or the new liberal turn from the 70s and 80s on, building their own neighborhoods and finding solution, transportation, housing and education, etc. Then the third condition is sort of the new suburbs based on American model of automobile-driven suburbia. And this is the state response to informality. So this is an image of the deteriorating urban core. This is where cluster is actually located, the city center. You can see the signs of urban decay and deterioration. This is a typical image of an informal development. And you can see it's, unlike Latin American informal squatter settlement, it's more consolidated and very dense and built out of concrete frames. And this is the third sort of suburbia with golf courses and gated communities and malls, etc. Now, the contrast between the 2 is classic. You can see it in all cities in the global south, between the ways the city is represented by official, you know, the opulence, Dubai on the Nile kind of narrative, versus where the majority, we're talking here about 70% of housing stock in informal development. So this is not a marginal phenomenon, this is a mainstream urbanization processes. The segregation and the juxtaposition between the two is very stark. So you cut through an informal neighborhood to connect the city center to the new suburb. And in doing so, you're disconnecting a certain community and building these pedestrian bridges nobody uses, of course. And in many cases, you are reminded as a citizen living in informal area, crossing these barriers to this other part of the city of your condition. So it's a very grounded experience, not a conceptual idea. So these physical markers are there, and they're experienced as you go to school or you go to work or you go to. Now, towards the turn of the century, the city decided to build a ring road to divert regional traffic, but also to put a new limit to the city and stop the expansion of informal areas on agricultural land, which is a major issue. What these ring roads and highways are doing are cutting through informal areas, bypassing informal areas, but they're not lending access to them. So you have this very, let's say, dramatic situation when you can touch the highway from your window, but literally touch it, but you don't have access to it. So communities start to find solutions, informal solution by building informal staircases and ramps to have access and to link the informal mode of transportation on the ground to other modes like the microbus, which would take you to the metro, etc. So you have multiple points of transfer from the formal and informal. So we see the relationship between the formal and informal as a spectrum, as opposed to black and white, something that I will come back to. And then lastly is the perception in formal area till maybe the 2011 urban revolt was limited by the majority of the middle class, the perception or limited or mediated through driving on the highway and seeing it from a Kodak range, if you will. So there's some sort of an abstraction, an ungrounded experience, and the stereotypes and demonization and stigmatization is rampant. In the meantime, the city is sort of embarking on grand visions that are, of course, based on this concept of the smart city and what have you. Of course, Dubai being the reference, Singapore being the reference, etc. So the contrast could not be starker between the everyday urban experience on the ground and these grand visions that is taking place. We're now building also a new capital, something I will not be talking about today, but we can also talk about it in Q&A. So the revolution or the revolt was not an accident. It was a matter of why or if. It was a matter of why it took so long. So we started very quickly to try to capture this moment and see how urban spaces are being reconstituted and restructured literally and physically by protesters and communities. So for example, a space like that, and I know, for example, in Minneapolis, you had a similar, maybe smaller scale event when the protester created a tent city, memorial for the martyrs. In this case, there were like field hospitals, barricades, prayer area, etc. And we tried to unlock it and to understand how these structures are being developed, who are the actors, what are the modes of development, etc. We're also trying to look, we argued that what happened back then was basically a louder and more spectacular and larger version of an urban protest, of a much slower and gradual silent revolution, if you will, that takes place every day on every sidewalk by street vendors and other disenfranchised community members. So, we can always look at more subtle manifestation of these spectacular moments, looking for cues. So what we call the city in flux was taking place in the city center, but also taking place in the back streets, where the contestation between the planned and unplanned, between the official and everyday is taking place by other uses. Again, the question is, how are people organizing these other activities? Who's setting the terms? What are the rule systems, et cetera, et cetera? are they agreed upon? I'm just going to maybe skip a little bit to move forward, but this is one of the major examples that I would like to maybe show you a small video in a bit. And community got together to build a ramp, on and off ramp, to connect their informal area to the highway, right, passing by them. This is a very important infrastructure project that requires very sophisticated organizational skills and fundraising and technical know-how, etc. It goes beyond the little sort of survival strategy of a street vendor. So we need also to be aware that it's not just about the small scale, but there are also large scale projects that are undertaken by community that we need to pay attention to. And finally, here we look at spatial cues as architects of, let's say, how informal housing is being developed. So rather than see it as random or chaotic, we understand that there is a bottom-up, let's say, structure or a pattern based on the units and how the relational pattern as opposed to the top-down master plan. So here is a geometrical pattern, there is a certain organization that's not a rigid sort of New York style iron grid. So again, you look at cues as certain community organizational patterns, and from there you start to look at other patterns. So one of the key projects that we did in the beginning called Archiving the City of Flux. So we tried to look at this array of images and events taking place every week. There's a fire, there's a protest, there's this and that, and try to find a way to represent and abstract it. So this is one way to look at one monument in the city and that was subjected to either revolution, the moment of victory, commemoration of martyrs, restoration, etc., and try to find graphic, technique to simplify communication. So that was one of the early techniques. Then we looked at street vendor, and this is a very important research project that really tried to unlock this question of contestation of public space. So street vendors are important because 50% of GDP is informal. It's important economically, but it's also important spatially because street vendors usually take place at the sidewalk. And the sidewalk is the margin between the private property and the public domain. So this gray zone is really, unlike North America and Europe, is very clearly demarcated, and you know what your rights are and duties are on public. The sidewalk in Egypt is much more contested. The things you can and cannot do depending on who you are, your status, your gender, et cetera, et cetera. So for example, the fact that there's no parking sign doesn't mean that you can park. It depends on, the shop owner, depends on the time of the day, depends where you're going to, how long you're gonna wait. So there's so many rule systems and frames of reference that govern what can be done. So in order to unpack that, we use street vendor and the 1 square meter footprint at the site where all these competing interests intersect. So the shop owners, the residents, the passers-by, the motorists, etc. Everybody has an interest in what happened. So to do that, we kind of use time-lapse photography to compress a 24-hour cycle into a minute or two, so that we don't observe as you pass in 30 seconds, you can see what happened in terms of what happens in the evening, what happens, who cleans after, what happened with the police raid, what is the relationship, the distance between vendors and themselves and vendors and the shops, who determines this distance, etc., etc. So this technique is kind of useful to have a more sort of a macro level of a very small small scale process. And then you take this video and then you kind of dissect it into pivotal moments between the public and the private, and then you start to work from there. Then you can also start to develop what we call informal standards or performance-based standards or codes, and try to realize there is a certain distance that's always left between the street vendor and the shop, and it's not random, but it's governed by certain consideration, etc. This is another example that is more of a seasonal cycle during Ramadan, with a soup kitchen or iftar that takes place exactly at the same moment. So here, there's a sort of a temporal dimension. The soup has to be, the meal has to be served hot in the same moment. So again, who organizes this meal? How many lanes are taken, where the food comes from, who cleans after? All these questions has to be answered, and it requires a bit of understanding of the stakeholders. When there's a conflict or a fight over space, then you need to understand who are the different actors and who are and what are the interests of each. So we started to develop different mapping technique of stakeholders. For example, this is based on the scale from the street to the neighborhood to the city to the even the national level, or the different organizations and actors are who all have an interest what happened on this 1 square meter. It's another representational mode. I'm sorry, the resolution is not very good. It's a different technique. Then in 2014, one of the first actions by the state after the restoration of order was to evict street vendors. And you can see here the symbolic meaning of these vendors. They're seemingly very vulnerable and helpless, but here you have 4 arms of the state mobilized to evict street vendors. So that tells you something about the significance of this seemingly trivial or insignificant phenomenon. Anyway, so that's one important sort of tools, a set of tools we developed, and we use it in our design project. I will show you later. This is another example of what we call roadside development, informal development, or activities such as people selling accessories or tea stands on the side of the road, or repair shops. So after the revolution, there was a moment of suspension of order, a temporary suspension of order, where people got more emboldened and start building more permanent structures. So what we did is we went around the ring road and we GPSed the location of each one of these activities on the road, and we started to measure the distance between each staircase, each bus stop, micro bus stop, each cafe, and to also induce certain patterns. What govern these distances? If I was going to design a road in the future, what kind of bus stops I should be designing to accommodate this, for example, or access to the road by community, etc. This is the example I talked about, the off-ramp that was built in 3 months at the peak of the revolution. So from a dirt road to more consolidated one. And this is a 1 minute video made by the community themselves. And the reason they did that is that they knew that their action was, they was using this window of opportunity, as they called it, and they knew eventually with the restoration of order, their act could be criminalized as illegal. So what they did is they used this opening and they developed this presentation, and they sent it to the governor and the police chief and invited them to come and cut the ribbon at the moment when the state was most vulnerable. So the governor came and they blessed this project as the heroic deed of revolution citizens, and they even installed underneath a traffic police point. So anyway, so the project got formalized, and I think this is also something to look at, not only at the technical part of but the political and how savvy the community are, and they predicted that their project has a short-term span and you need to quickly took advantage of this moment. The second part, a few years down the line, we started to get a little bit more confident about our research and the tools we developed. So we wanted to implement that into a design project and more proactive intervention. So this is a classic project that most of people in Cairo at least know about it. It's called Downtown Cairo Passages. It started out as a observation that downtown, which is basically, you can call it, the colonial part of the city, model after Paris and Vienna, etc., in the late 19th century with the Haussmannian, grid and radial plan, which is the image to the right. But downtown also embodies a network of in-between spaces, gaps between buildings and side streets and courtyards and alleyways that are less conspicuous, and they usually are also spaces of more, let's say, more diverse, because they are less, as I say, conspicuous. So there are more possibility to have activities that you cannot have on public space. For example, you can have bars and cafes and stuff on the back side, but you don't have it on the front, etc. We also saw this space in between, not only as a physical gap, but also as a space of mediation, or the condition of in-betweenness between the public and the private, as I showed, between the formal architecture and informal vernacular, and of course as a space of liminality and transition, hence the passageway. And of course, we were living back then in a moment of transition from a political regime to another. So it became very appropriate metaphor, urban metaphor. But we also saw that altogether this network of passageways may offer alternative vision to reimagine downtown from the inside out, if you will. So you can have, bikeways, greenways, book fairs, art festivals, etc., etc. Things that are not able to have on the main street because of traffic and security concerns. You can do it in the backside, right? This is we started doing all the mapping and all the sort of the technical. Sure, you all know how this kind of footprint and figure plan. We built a website of this database with interviews and land uses, and then in 2015 we decided to test this hypothesis. How can this passageway become a spaces of more inclusive and diverse public space? So we started with a small pilots. And the other hypothesis we had is the role of art as an urban catalyst. So we looked at one of the passageways, and then the building next to it had 3 or 4 empty warehouses. For decades, we were empty. So we convinced the owner to turn it into temporary art exhibition. This is Hassan Han exhibition. This is during the installation. Sound installation, and we wanted to see the impact of this new activity to, let's say, activate and introduce different kind of demography, not only working class, or not only middle class, or not only men, or not only certain age group, but to sort of introduce other layers and in a way kind of revitalize and regenerate these public spaces to become a little bit more active. It was very successful, so we got encouraged to apply for a grant from the Danish institutes in Egypt to do a project on the public space, not inside but outside. So we chose 2 passages, one that is more commercial and one that is sort of more monumental. The way we did it, we kind of went back to our tools that we developed during our street vendor project, and we started by engaging stakeholders and asked them, the food vendors, the residents, the landlords, heritage preservation groups, women rights groups, security, police, etc. What would they like to see and what their concerns are? And we developed a matrix of do's and don'ts. This is important. Why? Because in Cairo, we still do not have local councils. We don't have public hearings. So there is no formal mechanism for participatory planning. So we had to invent this or experiment with alternative mode to engage the stakeholders. So we created a very systematic stakeholder analysis. And out of these do's and don'ts, we developed a design brief. And we asked our design team to use their design elements, streetscape elements that I will show you, as sites to not resolve, but at least negotiate the conflict between the wish list of the different stakeholders. So for example, some people were completely opposed to having benches because that would solicit, certain activities that you don't like, or like public affection, for example. Some people were against putting a shading device because they thought that would entice people to come and pray, etc. So we had to find a way to resolve this in something we call urban diplomacy, and I will talk about it now. But we also had to find the different tools to communicate with the different stakeholders. So if you're approaching the authorities, you want to use a 3D rendering corporate style so that they take you seriously. You have to dress up. You have to talk in the language and the discourse that they want to hear, sustainable city, smart city, etc. But if you're talking to the community members, you have to find different language. And you have to put yourself in a position of each stakeholder and try to identify with their priority. Also, working in public required a set of permits from 6 or 7 authorities, from infrastructure to above the ground, etc. So that was very also challenging. After that, after we designed, we developed the design, started to propose certain ideas that was based on something. We had a competition, and the winning scheme was called the urban garden. And the idea was to bring nature back to this concrete jungle downtown, because we have very limited green space, Cairo. So again, we did our homework, looking at different plantation, different plants, different vegetation, their size, their proportion, their prices, etc. It's during the construction. You can see here the elements are very simple: the tree, the bench, the tile, and the lampposts. We found an old Art Deco sort of lamp, and we reproduced and we use it. But again, going back to this idea of negotiation, it came down to even the tile. We had to go around and get approval. Some shops were opposed to having entry outside their shop because it will, block the view, etc. So we had to make trades. If you agree to put a tree, we'll compromise and make this for you, etc. And we had to do these trade-offs. For the bench, we resorted to a trick. We told the authorities, okay, we're not going to do benches, but we will do a raised curb as a lighting element, and they knew we were bluffing, but they let it go. And we promised some of them that we will try it for a week. If they don't like it, we'll remove it. We had to do all this kind of negotiation techniques to be able to convince them until we win their trust. So again, here your role as an architect is not a designer, but more of a facilitator, negotiator, and activist. And maybe 70% of the time spent in this project was unrelated to design issues. It was related to community engagement and approvals and getting consent, etc. The project, when it was finished, it was very well received, and you can see issue of accessibility, things that you may take for granted in North America and Europe, but to have an even pavement is in itself a huge upgrade. Of course, the garden became a very popular destination downtown, and I'm going to show you some people are using Instagram, etc. When the project was completed, it was very successful. So we wanted to move to another step, which is looking at rooftops downtown also as another space of under interstitial spaces. Rooftops are junkyards, are left over. Everything is kind of dumped in the garden, in the rooftop. There are some services, and the contrast between the facade and the rooftop is also very stark. So we looked at a network of rooftops, and we looked at possibility of greening, using pop-up restaurants. We also wanted to see how can we use this small project to regenerate literally dilapidating structures downtown. Downtown, over the past 40 years or so, have been undergoing a process of, let's call it degentrification. There's a sort of the middle class was leaving downtown to more hip neighborhoods, and there was a gradual decay and disinvestment because of rent control or other reasons. So all the infrastructure is really falling apart. So we wanted to use this idea of if we develop a passageway and a rooftop and in between linkages. So this is a model of a building that we wanted to work on. How can we upgrade or use these shafts, light shafts, and service stairways that were unused as a way to upgrade and regenerate. So this is just an image of the state of decay of the basement and water seepage underground, etc. This I'm going to skip some of the drawings because I'm interested in the process. But again, so our work in downtown, whether the passageways and the rooftop or street vents, allowed us to become a hub to bring together stakeholders from the government, the authorities, to the private sector, to the civil society. And we organized a number of forums, such as this conference in 2015 or 16. And during that conference, we organized a number of tours to rediscover downtown through the passageways from different lenses, like, you know, the cinematic city or photographic city, how you can see downtown from the lens of the movies that were shot downtown, and see this some of the on bikes, etc. So it was an opportunity to revisit our initial hypothesis of these passageways as an alternative framework for downtown, but here we're trying to actualize it or activate it. We also produce a publication, a guidebook, a map. This is the passageway. A few years after, we even organized a number of events to see how it could also be used as a food festival, etc. And then the last thing we did before the project concluded was we organized a community board or a street board, a passageway board, in which we asked representatives of each building around the passageway to form a committee. And then we attended the first two meetings and provided them with a maintenance plan for irrigation, electricity, etc. And then we stepped out. And then since then, every season they decorated with Christmas or Eid. And as I said, it became really an Instagram moment downtown. Another project, and I'm aware of the time is running out, so I'm going to be a little faster here. This is a project that we did with the University of Zurich in ETH in 2016 to 18, looking at the question of urban informality from the housing perspective. And you can see here informal development on agricultural land. This is a 30 or 40 year interval map. You can see how the housing follows the irrigation pattern. So you can understand the logic behind it. So the main street and sub street, etc. And then how the land is divided in small plots and how each plot becomes residential unit, and then how the residential is being built through a certain logic, a structural element, skeleton, and then there's a core, there's a veneer, etc. And we looked also at the construction process, the economy, the actors, the process of bringing more cement and concrete, etc. Then we asked students, after having identified the different types of informal housing, it's not random, but there's certain logic. We asked students to introduce small and subtle interventions that would not disrupt this ecosystem, but improve the quality of life, whether ventilation or privacy or environmental issues. So I'm just going to show one example. So this student, what he did, I think it was he in that case, decided to use the same system, but take the staircase from the core and wrap it around the building from now. And in doing so, he would create gaps between buildings and introduce like air tunnels. And so these are some of the drawings. This is a typical elevation and section. This is a collage of inserting. So you can see this approach is the opposite of the state approach, which is about demolishing the whole neighborhood and building, tabula rasa kind of public housing project based on modernist planning, etc., and towers in a park, etc. So here is a sort of a similar approach from the bottom up, from the gaps. This is another project also in another informal area. With the approach was about environmental to address in climate change. So there's a rooftop element. I'm just skipping a bit faster here. There was a sort of a public space element. And here, what's the lesson is more important. When you're building in an informal area that doesn't have a grid, right? What kind of geometrical order and how can you be flexible in the drawing and remain, like, have a coherent structure, but yet be sensitive to the possibility of change on the ground. Some of the form work and tiling taking place. This is another element of the same project, the shading device on top of the informal markets. Again, a retractable system without disrupting the market. From aerial view on another image. Again, these are very small scale projects, facade painting, etc. And then at the end, there was also a mural for awareness raising, etc. Then the third and last phase, and maybe I'll have maybe part of it, is as things became more and more restricted in Cairo, we started to look for projects outside in regional partners in Amman and Beirut, currently in Tunis, Morocco, to build on our track record of mapping and small-scale intervention and trying to see how this project could gain other experience and also exchange our knowledge. So this is a project in Amman. Amman is a hilly town. This is a historic image in how it evolved. And to the right is Amman today. So it's a very staggered city, but there are a set of stairways, and we took cues from our passageway project, and we started to develop the typical section, the paradigmatic section, the hilltop, the valley, and the slope. And how can this slope becomes also a key to unlock this complex city? And we did all this methodology of mapping, and then the whole cascade of staircase from the hilltop to the bottom. And we started to map all the activities, heritage buildings, interviews with families, etc. Typology, also similar to what we did in the downtown passages, you know, the slope, the heights, the length, the form, etc. We also built a website that you can also access with all the database. So again, this is based on the investment we did in Cairo in the past 3 years, sharing it with us. We're currently doing a project in Tangier in Morocco. It's ongoing. We're looking at informal urban processes, transportation and housing, garbage collection, food, etc. We're still in the middle of the process. It's a bit on hold because of the travel restriction, but we're supposed to travel there a couple of months. There's another one in Tunis. It's more about architecture heritage. You can see here a number of itineraries similar to what you did in downtown Cairo, and also trying to find creative ways to graphic techniques to present it that are innovative, etc. Last 2 years, we started a project in downtown to introduce bikeways. So we were given this concept drawings from a different consultant in Kenya, I think. And we were supposed to do detailed drawing for these bikeways. Now, the challenge for bikeways in Cairo is that there are no real standards, local standards. So you can either adopt standards from Amsterdam or Vancouver or what have you, or you start to think of alternative standards based on certain practices, right? So you can have the tricycle, there's like the guy who carries the bread on his head, or delivery person. So how could you develop certain standards and develop certain sections from these? So, and then we also use the bikeway project as opportunity to upgrade the standards of accessibility of curb cuts and the crossings, etc., that are really non-existent in Cairo. I'm just going to show you an example of one of the pilots we did to the left, a curb cut, which is, not very, original for you, but in Cairo it was very high standard. And this is some of the rendering. The project, unfortunately, was put on hold because this is also part of the larger picture. The state has other agenda for downtown, and they're thinking of turning it completely pedestrian. So they terminated the contract, and now downtown is undergoing larger transformation. One of the last projects I want to show you is a project on looking at the formal-informal interface, and I talked earlier about this spectrum between the formal and the informal. And you can see here let's say, how the formal and informal are juxtaposed. There are not real clear boundaries, such as this example. So we looked at 3 cities in Egypt: Cairo, Alexandria, and Minya, Upper Egypt. And we developed a methodology. I'm just talking about method here than defining. So we looked at the node scale, the crossing scale, the district scale, and the city scale. And we looked at 4 variables: the borders, the crossing, the activities, and the flows. And out of that, we created a framework to map out and investigate this interface between formal and informal. I'm going to show you also another technique we used. So this is a boundary, a railway with a number of crossings. And what we did is we wanted to map out a journey. So this is one of the nodes. We wanted to map out a journey from an informal area, somebody living in an informal area, taking a tuk-tuk until this node, crossing the bridge, then taking a microbus, which would take this person to the metro, which would take this person to the city center. And this map, the red being the informal, the officially informal, and the red is the officially formal or planned. And the diagram to the left show you the multiple ways you can use, a tuk-tuk, then a microbus or a bus, or walk a little bit, etc. But this journey we use to measure at each stage the percentage of formality and informalities. For example, for the microbus, the driver might be non-registered or even underage, but the vehicle is licensed, but the fare is negotiated, but they follow the traffic rules, but the gasoline is bought from the formal station. So there's a mix. For the tuk-tuk, it's mostly informal. For the metro, it's mostly formal, but there's a gradual transition as opposed to these black and white formal informal. And then we did a comic style, sort of animation style storyboard to communicate this process to a wider audience. And I'm going to just video, and maybe that will be the end of my presentation, or then talk a little bit about the
شوكولاته محشي، شوكولاته بالبن، شوكولاته باللون، بيعطينا 3 5 جنيه.
Okay. Then this project, when we finished it, we were invited to be part of a regional network of other cities in Africa, and Tanzania, Zambia, and Burkina Faso, where we explore this concept formal informal through a series of workshops looking at other themes. This is a number of workshops. So in Lusaka, we looked at the food process. In Dar es Salaam, we looked at infrastructure and water system. And we started to develop similar diagrams at other urban journeys or narrative from the formal, from the farm to the food market, central market, for example, or from the water source to the end user. These are some of the diagrams. It hasn't been published yet, so these are some of the similar journeys in different cities. Now, I have maybe 8 more minutes. Is that correct, Gabriel?
Yes, that's
okay.
Great.
Okay, so I'll race through this large project and then conclude with grounded urban practice. So this is in 2018, downtown is becoming, as I said, more difficult. So we started to open a new branch or a space in the neighborhood of Ard al-Lawa, an informal area where most of our project. This space is, so it's located here in the red area. It's a space of encounter between formally trained designers and art students on the one hand, and craftsmen and artisan people in informal economy. And through making, there's a process of knowledge exchange and through co-learning, through co-production, if you will. So we use, state-of-the-art laser cutter, etc., 3D printer, CNC, but we also use the tools and manual tools and power tools. We did a number of workshops with the community. One of them was upcycling, so going to a junkyard. This neighborhood has the second largest recycling community. So there's a lot of leftover material, construction material, etc., broken furniture. And out of this, we produce some ideas. This the most current project, and this is going to be my last project, is a project we did in December to repaint the facade of this space along with other space and neighborhoods as a way to promote business and enhance the visibility. So the design process involved our team at Cluster Designers, but the production was basically through this encounter between craftsmen and students. This some of the processing production. You can see it's very basic techniques, printing and then using tape and etc. But the key issue here that I would like to talk about, this is the post-production image, is this kind of organic relationship between the formal and the informal, something that we're becoming more and more interested, and the role of creative industry, if you will. And I think we argue that the creative economy and creative class, something that needs to be deconstructed and reframed from a global South perspective, because unlike Europe and North America, where the creative class emerged with the shift from industrial to post-industrial cities and economies, in the global South, the response to the neoliberal term was primarily informal. So informal economy, informal initiatives are creative solutions by communities in response to the withdrawal of the state and regulation. So this project and these other projects in parallel, it's an old cafe in another city in northern Egypt, a vintage cafe. You can see that was, underwent a number of destruction, etc., and renovation. We wanted to store the traditional vintage signage system, which is the gilded glass style. So we sort of, searched who's still doing that, and it was a dying technique, almost like extinct. So we tried to find somebody who's still doing it. We resorted to hand calligraphers, also very few are there. And we started to use this technique, but also introducing contemporary ones like still screening, etc. And then this is more of a documentation of the process. And then the installation involved also, metal workers, electricians, painters, and this is when the project was completed. Now, when we mapped out the actors who were involved in these two projects overlaid on this formal informal map, official map of planned versus unplanned, you realize that there is much more organic and intermingled, interconnected network. That in every stage there is a percentage, even on a cluster. We're registered and working officially in tax paying, it's everything. But some of the work has to be outsourced to craftsmen who are not registered. So what do you do? What kind of relation? What kind of language as a designer to communicate with drawing or with models or with sketches? Do you go work with them, etc.? So these are different ways. We're still experimenting with their presentation. Anyway, I would like to just conclude with just the last few minutes on grounded improv practice. So what I kind of shared with you is an array of projects, a sample of projects that really position our practice in the middle between, let's say, the realm of the creatives and the realm of the activists. And this is what grounded improv practice. And what I also showed you is this pendulum, this process of oscillation between different positions. When things were high, revolutionary moment, and we were all dreaming of changing the world, we were able and we had the luxury of being idealist and radical and etc. But when things start to get more conservative, you have to also find a way to get some project, but find within it a possibility of being progressive. So again, there is a bit of coping mechanism and resilience. So we need to also be clear about that. It's not just about being, you stick to your principle and get out of business. You have to find a way to. So grounded improv practice, we define them as we use space as an agent of change, a spatial catalyst, if you will. There are three characteristics what we find common. They are rooted in communities and the neighborhoods. They are critical of the status quo, whether the state or the private sector, corporate development, and they're experimental with new legal and financial organizational models. So we did a project 2 years ago mapping, organization like cluster in Cairo. We started with Cairo and Amsterdam. And we realized that this is not specific to Cairo movement, but the moment of catalysm was the urban revolution, 2011. But in Amsterdam, it was the financial crisis when a lot of architects, were finding no jobs, so they started to do other work. But there is a sort of a more systematic or systemic structural change across the globe. We can call it the neoliberal turn. So we did a research project where we looked at the roots and the reasons behind their emergence, their structure and organizational structure, the strategies and methods and tools like the one I showed you, the risks and opportunity. We looked at the pedagogical elements, the networking and alliance building, and the political advocacy. So this is a map of the samples. We did a sample of 12 in Cairo. This is a timeline. You can see 2011, there was a sort of almost like an important moment when most of them started. Some of them had earlier origin, and some diagrams of the type of activities, the heritage versus housing versus transportation. And then we did the similar thing in Amsterdam. There's some initiative in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and also in Berlin. We just finished a publication in Berlin, looking at also, you can see in Amsterdam, the financial crisis, 2008, was this pivotal moment. Berlin, something that was related to the reunification, and then it was also financial crisis, etc. I'm going to stop here. I think I'm right on time. And I would like to thank you for your attention. And I know it's been a long presentation, but I think what I meant to do is to share with the students in particular, as much as possible, a wide range of tools and methods that may help you to think in your studio, in the assignment that we're working on starting today. How can we engage stakeholders? How can we develop a bottom-up processes? How can we find small-scale intervention that has a larger conceptual framework what is the sort of interface between the formal and informal? Maybe in North America, the informal, we need to redefine it, but the formally trained and those who are working without necessarily formal education. And I think most of all, what is the social commitment that architecture has today? And I think this is important for the whole workshop, the lowercase a architecture. I think the past 3 or 4 decades, from the 80s on, architecture has been, in a way, losing grounds, and we've been seeing more and more aesthetically driven designs and rendering, and of course with digital rendering, etc. But also the pedagogy is also sometimes gets lost in this kind of politically correct discourse, and we need to reclaim our cities, and we need to start from the space of citizens. I think that's what I would like to maybe to conclude with. And thanks again, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you so much. That was an incredibly inspiring talk. Really generous, and yeah, the work is captivatingly multifaceted, and definitely is going to inspire this week, I'm sure. We already have a few questions, both from YouTube and from the Zoom Q&A. For those of you in the webinar, feel free to drop your question into the Q&A, and we'll go through them over the next 15-20 minutes. We could start with this one, which I think looks interesting. This is from student Jacob Mala. I'm wondering about the intersection of formal and informal within your practice and the way you work. Do you see the projects you do as being informal or formal, or both? Working with the city, but also working for the people?
Okay. I think that's an important question. I'm going to use it to maybe open up a larger question. What is our position? What is us as architects and practitioner position vis-a-vis the informal sector, the informal urbanism? In cities in the global south, in Africa, for example, some cities have up to 80% self-built, right? Or self-generated. So now informality is not a marginal phenomenon or something on the interstate. We don't have the luxury to ignore it. Otherwise, we will limit our practice to the 5 or 10% who can afford to hire an architect. Okay, so we're risking marginalizing ourselves. So it's not really an option. We have to really shift gear and develop skills to engage informality. Now, to do that, we have to also be very critical, because engaging informality doesn't necessarily mean that you're acknowledging informality as a solution to our cities, because informality, and I'm sure all of you know, it's a very conservative solution. It's about private actors pursuing private interests. So the question of public good, the question of scale, these questions that cannot be resolved on an informal micro scale. So our position is, when we have to be aware not to romanticize informality, but we also understand that the state solution of demolishing it and formalizing it is not also valid. The state doesn't have either the capacity or the political will to change 40 years of informalization overnight, over 2 years. So what do we do? So our position is, we advocate a long-term solution of a strong democratic state that provides for its citizens. The state has a responsibility to provide housing. But in the interim period, maybe for the next generation or so, informality is here to stay, so we have to deal with it. So the position that we take now is, we need to, in these 20 years to come or so, we need to develop tools and methods to engage informality and find a way to engage it on its own terms, such as the housing project. We understand, to decode it, to unlock it, to understand the mechanism whereby it was developed, and then based on that, find ways to engage it without disrupting the zone. So that's our position, and therefore we see ourselves at sort of this gray zone between the formal and informal, and we delicately negotiating that, and we are happily occupying this in-between space, geographically and also institutionally.
Thank you, Omar. That's amazing. Another question in the Zoom from Tom Fisher, a faculty member here. How has your terrific body of work affected policy? Has it forced those in power to change their plans or ideas about the city?
Well, again, so there's of course we have to be very honest about. So our body of work is out there. I think the impact it has was mostly on either small scale projects, the surrounding community, local context, and or on students and practitioners who see in our work an alternative mode of practice. In terms of the city at large, we were not able to scale up our projects. And I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe it's a good thing. But the reality is the power relation after the first 2 years of the revolution has changed. And the state became more and more, let's say, adopting a top-down approach. And the community, the ability of community to voice their concern and advance alternative bottom-up approach became almost impossible. And we can talk about the reason behind that. But at this stage, I think our work has maintained this small to medium scale approach. The authorities are aware. We've presented our work many times. They know our work. Sometimes it's appropriated and used for other agendas. So we're also a little bit sensitive not to give them the opportunity. But I think if you look at the urban policy in Egypt today, it's mostly following sort of a grand scale, the largest, the biggest, the highest, the tallest, and they're not very interested in this bottom-up approach. So unfortunately, it does not resonate with the current urban policy.
Thank you, Omar. There's two questions which are, I think, quite aligned, so I'll read them together. This was from Mary Begley in YouTube. I'm wondering, what are the implications of formalizing the informal, mapping the pathways, also makes known, their location visible? Does that change the informality of the spaces? And student Lechi Yang in the webinar is asking, in one of our studios, we studied and looked at the patterns of houselessness and informal encampments in the Twin Cities. One of the things that we learned was that when these encampments were made visible and known, they were forcefully vacated. What are some of the implications of cartographing mapping spaces, especially those that occur at the margin of rules that are not meant to be mapped?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Of course, we're aware of the risk of rendering visible the invisible. That's something it doesn't go unnoticed. However, it's not always the case. Sometimes communities are interested to have their agenda being advanced. For example, in the informal area we work on, there are a network of small workshops and mechanics and metal workers, and they're not on the map. And that, in a way, limit their marketing outreach to a certain demographic. Now, we work with them to develop a map, almost like a directory of it's almost like a Home Depot, but on a community level, right? So who are these businesses? Who is doing the polishing? Who is doing the varnishing? Who's doing the glass work, etc.? What are the capacities? What are their, etc.? Now, in this particular case, it was useful for them because it helped them to open new markets. On the other hand, we're very sensitive to the possibility of making them more vulnerable in terms of taxes, insurance, etc. So how to go around that is to really be honest, be transparent, and before you embark on any project, you work with them and ask them, is that something you'll be interested in or not? There's no, let's say, universal rule for that. It's a case by case. And I think you have to acknowledge that it's an issue, but it's not always positive or negative. You have to take case by case. But it's a very important question.
Thank you. A question from Julia Robinson, also a faculty member at the university here. What is the role of pedagogy and students in this approach? How can the university play a part in this approach?
Yes, I think what maybe I was alluding to is, since at least in our cities, this part of the world, informality plays the majority of urban landscape is produced informally. Unfortunately, in our universities, at least when I was studying, and I think till now, the lens to study informality is one of it's eradicated or at best reformed, right? So it is a problem. We need to change the mindset. We need to try to find solution in it. It should be part of the solution, and that requires a different set of tools. The first one is you need to move the studio from the studio space to the neighborhood and break the psychological barrier. There's a lot of psychological barrier. These areas are seen as dangerous, as conservative, as fundamentalist, as this and this and that, and that's due in part to the media demonization, stigmatization. So part of it's psychological, and part of it is we need to sort of rehumanize these neighborhoods, and again find tools and reintroduce it to our studios. And I think if you look at the grounded urban practice publications we did, there is a section on pedagogy and how some of these tools could introduce into courses. We do that when I get to teach every once in a while, like this opportunity. I teach part-time. I bring this to the studio, hoping that it will be disseminated to other studios. But I think it needs to be mainstreamed on different levels. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thanks for the question, Julie, and thanks, Omar, for the really amazing reply. Couple more questions, and then yeah, wonderful conversation. So, okay, this one is from Athar Mufreh. She's also an instructor here. Is as follows. Our work as architects, urbanists, and spatial practitioners is always influencing and influenced by the political context and social movements, and this is shown well in your work. How do you see the role of architects becoming more empowered? What do you hope for the future of the profession?
I think the presentation is the answer. I think there are a number of things. I think there's a lot of people doing good work. The Grounded Urban Practice project aimed, maybe not explicitly, is to build a social movement or a network or a wave of, so to connect GUPs or Grounded Urban Practice in different cities. So now we're reaching out to, after doing Cairo, Tunis, Berlin, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, now we're reaching out to partners in Latin America, in Bogota, and Mexico City, in South Asia, India, and Pakistan. We're hoping that maybe in the next World Urban Forum or something, there would be a panel on grounded urban practice, and it could be recognized as something, because one of the key problems of the grounded is we don't have an institutional template or format. So we are part of our Architecture Association or the Planner Association, which is basically, you get commissioned by a project or you win a competition, and that's it, you register. In grounded urban practice, 80% of our projects are self-invented. So you start with an idea of an observation on the ground, then you critically analyze it, then you maybe apply for a funding to do research, another funding to do intervention, another funding. So it is very, it's a very different format for practice. And that requires, we're doing conferences and tours. These are not things, or website, these are not things that are part of architecture practice, right? So we need to find institutional structure to acknowledge, recognize this, and then empower it. Once it becomes recognized, then it will become a network, and then we can have some sort of a lobbying, maybe power. And that will enhance our possibility of advancing more change, in addition to this small scale attempts by cluster or many, many others. Yeah. So I'm hopeful, I'm very hopeful that lowercase architecture is recognizing that. That's already a sign of success to me, that we are being recognized across the globe as we're doing some meaningful work. and if this could be scaled up by others, and then there is more of this forum and debate, then I think there is hope that there will be a discussion of redefining the role of architects and urban practitioners. And I think towards the end of this workshop, maybe you can have another reflection to see to what extent were we successful in such a period of time to experiment with some of these tools. But yeah.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we will have to finish the questions here, although there were some unanswered ones. Hopefully over this week, we can continue to have a conversation. I just want to, thank you, and it's such a pleasure to host you in this online platform. I think the context reveal the way you work in Cairo is extremely inspiring and fascinating. And I think what many of the students will certainly pick up on is how this condition of city in flux that you described at the beginning of your presentation resonates very much with our city in the past, over the past year, with the Black Lives Matter movement and activists and civil society claiming public space in really important ways. So perhaps also in the Twin Cities, there's a space and a need for grounded urban practice. Thank you again, Omar. Really wonderful.
Thank you. So we'll reconvene with our students in an hour and a half, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And I just want to announce for everyone tuning in, this was the first of 4 lectures. Omar's talk will be followed by 3 more immediately at 10:30 Central Time. Alexandra Arène will present also a talk, and you can find the links in the Cargo website or in the course documents that you have. So more to come. Thank you so much, Omar, for kicking this off.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Bye.